Napoli were just existing, living day to day with the survival in the jungle known as Serie A in the 1980s. Up north, unimaginable glories and successes that never got handed down to the little people in the south of a country harshly divided in football. All it took was one little genius to change Calcio forever. Napoli, the house that Maradona built. Naples was famous for disaster initially. Mount Vesuvius had destroyed Pompeii, and an event that happened before Jesus Christ, our Lord and Saviour, allegedly walked on water still attracted people to the port city. It was only a matter of time then, as the 20th century creaked into life, that tourism would translate into football. So let's cram a history lesson in. 1903, this fella called William Potts finds himself in Naples. He grabs a friend called Emilio Anatra and assembles a team the year after to play some sailors at a game that they're calling football. It all gets a bit out of hand, and the club they set up becomes registered with the recently established Italian FA in 1906. 6 years later, they've bagged themselves a spot in the first division, and it's a further 14 years before they get awarded a spot in a freshly organised Serie A, thanks to a merger with Internazionale, and no, not that one from Milan. So far, so steady, until things get serious in the 30s and Napoli decide to hire Englishman William Garbett, who had won Serie A. Garbett delivers 2 podium finishes, but nothing of the sort would ever happen in Naples again. Not for a long time, anyway. An entire world war gets in between the clubs yo-yoing between the top 2 divisions before the aftermath of the decade known as the 1950s sees Napoli stay in the top flight for a full decade. Not that anything happened. No title races, no real threat of relegation, no excitement. Only when they get plunged into the cold water of Serie B in 1961 do they bounce back immediately and come up for air, clutching on to their first ever trophy, the Coppa Italia, after beating Spal. The top flight wouldn't last for the southern club at first, as their latest return in '65 comes with a newfound ambition. Jose Altafini, a player who 2 years previously scored 2 goals for Milan in a European Cup final, he was signed. On his back, the club was placed, and it is there where Napoli become a serious club again. Title challenges between 1966 and '68 give way to a trio of Coppa Italia finals, one of which was actually won in 1976 against Hellas Verona. The closest they ever did get to a Scudetto being pinned onto their shirt came in the 1974-75 season, except in typical Neapolitan fashion, they shot themselves in the foot. See, in the summer of '72, the club president Corrado Fulano thought it was a cracking idea to send Jose Altafini packing to Juventus. He believed that the striker's days were numbered. So off Altafini went up north along with Dino Zoff, and he scored 37 goals in 119 matches before retiring in 1976. Now that doesn't sound that spectacular really, but consider one of those 37 goals for a second longer. It was a barren December 1974 when Napoli met Juventus, in a rare occasion where Napoli actually proved competitive without Altafini. The match was bubbling to the surface, dead level, until a goal was scored late on. Of course, it was Jose Altafini who scored it, and come the end of the season, the gap of 2 points between the teams was only there because of Altafini's winner. Picture David Moyes' Everton only with an actual trophy, and you've probably got a good picture of what Napoli were like during the late 70s and early 80s. Good enough to survive, not good enough to challenge. They needed another hero. They had succumbed to 11th place, not their lowest ranking, but they escaped relegation by a solitary point. It didn't seem like Napoli would be an attractive proposition as the 80s prepared to become the 90s, but suddenly it was, and it's because of one man. And they fit like hand in glove. To get an idea why, we only have to go to the roots of Diego Armando Maradona. He was the fifth child in a large family growing up in a tough province south of Buenos Aires. His main worry wasn't his social standing with his peers or his education, but carrying a 20-litre oil drum full of water so his family had enough to drink. That life was all to change, the wheels set in motion on his third birthday when he was gifted a football. Soon enough, he'd get himself a hero, George Best, and one that he'd go on to emulate in more ways than he'd ever be able to imagine as a child. He shot to fame performing tricks at half-time during football matches in front of tens of thousands of people, and the inevitable professional debut came for Argentinos Juniors. After top scoring in the Metropolitano, the understandable clamour for the now 17-year-old Maradona to go to the home World Cup was insatiable, yet he was snubbed. He used that spite and that energy for good, however, top scoring in 2 more Metropolitanos and re-entered the international scene at the 1979 FIFA World Youth Championship in Japan. He netted 6 in as many games, including in the final, as he won the tournament's best player and Argentina claimed the victory. There was no going back. The subsequent year he had netted his 100th senior goal already, 4 of which came against his beloved Boca Juniors in a single match. With their heads sufficiently turned, he was prized away by the big fish of Argentine football. Unfortunately, Boca were mere minnows by the time the 80s had come around on the grander scheme of European football. So for his first stint, they only gleaned 28 goals in 40 games before he was snatched away in 1982. But first, he was finally picked for a World Cup and was destined for Spain that summer, whichever way you looked at it. As defending champions, the championships was a disaster for both Argentina and Maradona. La Albiceleste were dumped out at the weird second group stage by Brazil and Italy, and personally for Maradona, he ended the tournament by kicking a Brazilian player and received a red card. Still, at least we got a cool photo of him toying with Belgian players, even if the perspective is a little bit skewed. He remained in Spain and, as a 21-year-old, was ready to crack Europe. Unfortunately, he ran into a stumbling block known as the obdurate manager Udo Lattek, who seemingly had no time for the Argentine. With his first season saved by the oft-forgotten Copa de la Liga, Maradona was having a miserable time of it at the Camp Nou. The butcher of Bilbao Goycochea lived up to his name by putting Maradona on the treatment table for much of the subsequent 1983-84 season. Maradona would get his revenge though, not on the pitch in a football sense, but certainly on it from a let's have a fucking scrap sense. Picture the scene, a balmy May evening in Madrid, 100,000 people are watching you, including the king of the country that you're working in, and you've been kicked for a full 2 hours by somebody who's hurt you before, and he's not been punished. Your work's done, you've had a bad night, come away empty-handed. What do? Apparently, what you do is drop-kick your opponent and spark a mass brawl. That's what Diego Maradona did, anyway. Such an unsightly thing for a monarch to see, but fascinating for the audience. Either way, time was called in Spain for Maradona. With his reputation damaged by the sordid Copa final, just who would even think of touching the flawed yet absolutely brilliant footballer known as Diego Armando Maradona? Napoli as a team was a disgrace of nothingness. It was up to Diego Maradona to inspire this team, but after 2 wins from their first 13 games, he must have wondered why on earth he'd signed up for this project. Christmas allowed a break, a stock take, and both Napoli and Maradona came firing out of the blocks. Maradona netted himself 17 goals that season, and Napoli sped away from the threats of relegation into a comfortable position of 8th. 8th, though, wasn't going to cut it for Maradona. The onus was on Napoli to change, not the Argentine. So Ottavio Bianchi was drafted in as the new coach, despite the good second half of the season. Then they hit the transfer market hard. Scudetto winning goalie Claudio Garella was signed, as were the defenders of Alessandro Ranica and Massimo Falari, before Geraldo Pecci came in from Fiorentina. The best, however, was reserved for the front line as Bruno Giordano arrived. Napoli had the Ma of Maradona, the G of Giordano. The 1985-86 season was another example that they still had some way to complete the magic, however, as they only improved their goal tally to the tune of 1. However, in locking down the defence with only 21 goals conceded and a staggering 14 clean sheets from 30 matches, Naples had firm foundations for once. And what's more, they'd qualified for Europe. It was only Napoli's 13th campaign on the continent, fought solely in the Fairs Cup, UEFA Cup and Cup Winners' Cup, since they had never won a Scudetto. In this threadbare history of continental football, Napoli came the closest to silverware in the latter competition. First on their very first attempt all the way back in 1963, when they were eliminated in the third leg of a quarter-final with OFK Belgrade, before riding their second Coppa Italia triumph by reaching a semi-final, only to lose to Anderlecht. Since they participated in 3 successive Fairs Cup campaigns towards the back end of the 60s based on their moderately decent quality, and because qualification for the Fairs Cup wasn't based on league position. It was based on if you were a highest ranked team from your city. Napoli being effectively a one-club city and mid-table in Serie A, qualification wasn't an achievement. Eliminations were felt against Burnley, Hibs, Leeds and Ajax without any success. But in a much more competitive UEFA Cup, they could count on 4 ties won across 7 entries. Despite Maradona, this rotten form continued in another first round exit against Toulouse via penalties. Napoli, however, had a more balanced team, for all their misgivings in Europe. Daniel Bertoni was sold to Udinese in a swap deal that brought Andrea Carnevale to Naples. We had Magica, but not the Magica. Whilst it wasn't quite "we've got Magica at home" kind of Magica, it just wasn't the Magica. Their flag was planted with a November win over Juventus in Turin as well, and a match won where they were 1-0 down with 17 minutes to play. It was the first shot across the bow in a new age. The age of Platini was dead, the age of Maradona was now. Napoli still hadn't lost in the league either, and wouldn't until they visited Florence on January the 4th. Even then, they struck back with a vengeance, winning the next 5. Then that Neapolitan part of their brain kicked in. They'd win just 2 of the next 7. It could never be easy for a football team in the south. Crucial though was a 2-1 triumph in Milan, where who else but Diego Maradona scored the first half winner. Even then, the champagne had to be put on ice for a week later when Como held them to a draw. Still, a point at home to Fiorentina in the penultimate match would do it, and it was much better to do it in front of your own fans anyway. Roberto Baggio equalised Carnevale's goal, but it wasn't enough to dislodge Napoli. The graffiti outside the graveyards read, "You don't know what you're missing," but even those clutching onto the spray paint didn't know the half of it just yet. A 4-0 aggregate win over Atalanta in the Coppa Italia put the cherry on top of the cake. In achieving the Italian double, Napoli became only the 3rd side to do so, first being Il Grande Torino, the other being Juventus trio Magico. Quite the company to keep. In football, standing still is to go backwards. In Naples in the late 80s, keeping the same components of your Magica was to go backwards too, so in came Careca. Finally, we had our proper Magica. Not that it was a 3-man squad. Ciro Ferrara was coming through the academy, Fernando Di Napoli had hit the ground running in his first season, and the same was hoped for fellow new recruit Giovanni Francini at left-back. The seeds of the 87-88 season were already sown towards the back end of the prior campaign. Disdain was achieved between players and coach Ottavio Bianchi after he needlessly lambasted the squad for drawing their final match against Ascoli as champions. He'd remain in charge for the time being, but after being unfortunately drawn against Real Madrid in the first round of the European Cup, Napoli were on a hide into an early European exit again. Less forgivable was their domestic campaign that looked to be completely under control. Mirroring their previous season, Napoli didn't lose until the 1st January weekend, this time 4-1 at the San Siro. Just like previously, they rebuffed that first stumble with a mesmeric run, 7-1 on the bounce. March of '88 appeared and a Neapolitan wobble could still be corrected, even after one win from 4. Maradona's winner at home to Inter in April's first match appeared to signal as much, despite the monstrous beast that was the Milan of Arrigo Sacchi and Silvio Berlusconi, of Marco van Basten, Frank Rijkaard and Ruud Gullit hairing up behind them. Then came the almighty deluge of shit poured onto Napoli's season. Juve gained revenge in Turin, Verona held them, Milan completed the double before a loss to Fiorentina, funnily enough, was the final nail in the coffin. 2 wins from the last 10, it was never going to be enough to hold off a team as incredible as Arrigo Sacchi's Milan. They'd gone backwards both defensively and from an attacking standpoint in '88, despite the form of Careca. It didn't help they faced a team that only shipped 14 goals all season. Looking to Milan for inspiration, Napoli bolstered the midfield with Alamao and Luca Fusi, with the plan firmly to place only an attacking onus on Maradona. It didn't work. The beast of Milan came from Giovanni Trapattoni and his 3 Germans, as opposed to the 3 Dutchmen whom they shared their house with. Napoli improved going forward with crazy scorelines such as 8-2 versus Pescara, 5-3 versus Juventus, and even revenge over Milan by 4-1. It was never enough, as they buckled again in the second half of the season. Whilst the Coppa could have been an avenue for success, and Napoli did win the final's first leg at home to Sampdoria, there was the little matter of Gianluca Vialli and Roberto Mancini. They both scored in the return leg, and Napoli were left empty-handed domestically. But in Europe, they potted along in the final months of 1988 by scraping wins over PAOK, Lokomotiv Leipzig and PSG, before PSG had money. Europe really focused their minds as the league was busy being tossed away in the March of 1989. They had been drawn Juventus with a tantalising second leg in Naples. Perfect preparations were made with a battering of Lecce, but were quickly shelved thanks to an early goal for Juve in Turin. Holding on to a 2-0 defeat, Napoli's continental dreams appeared up in smoke again. Then Maradona scored a penalty. Cannavale added a second to bring parity to the situation before extra time delivered a last-gasp winner. Not from Maradona, he'd been subbed off, but from Alessandro Ranica, who had been barely scoring a handful of goals for the club. His 119th minute winner sent Naples into ecstasy, with only a second European semi-final booked in, where they'd face Bayern Munich. First leg at home, Napoli comfortably won out with 2 goals either side of the break from Careca and Cannavale before a storm needed to be weathered back in Munich. A Careca brace kept Napoli in the competition, and a 4-2 aggregate scoreline meant a first ever European final. The UEFA Cup final, through the lens of Maradona, was the parting gift to the people of Naples. Unfortunately, people don't always get their happy ending. Marseille and their rampantly ambitious owner Bernard Tapie had been casting fluttering eyelashes across the sea. It all fit perfectly. A kinder league, a quieter city, ample time to prepare for Italia 90, maybe even win some stuff, maybe even the European Cup. But Maradona got shot down by Napoli. He'd be left to the ravages of Naples. Of course, Maradona still gave Napoli the gift of the UEFA Cup, scoring in the 2-1 win over Stuttgart in the first leg before grinding out a draw necessary to lift the trophy. It could have been the start of a new Maradona, a new Napoli. The 90s were coming, the disliked coach was gone and he was being replaced by Alberto Bijon, but it wasn't. Maradona sunk deeper into the crutches of what Naples could offer around this time. Still, he found it within himself to drag Napoli to the title again in 1990, top scoring again as was tradition. But the magic was long gone. They'd end their wait for a win in the European Cup, but quickly found their demise to Spartak Moscow in the last 16 via a penalty shootout. Months later, Diego Maradona tested positive for cocaine, the traces of Naples' nightlife catching up to him with a hefty ban. He'd marauded back to Sevilla before returning home, first to Newell's Old Boys and then to his spiritual home of Boca. either side of the infamous drugs ban at the 1994 World Cup. As for Napoli, they too spiralled down the drain into an obscurity. Let's rush through the majority of the 90s, through its inadequacies of mid-table finishes, UEFA Cup exits to PSG and Eintracht Frankfurt, beyond the late heartache of the 1997 Coppa Italia final defeat to Vicenza. Whenever a player of quality sprouted up, a Gianfranco Zola or a Fabio Cannavaro, they'd be turned over for profit and replaced by something lesser. Napoli spent and spent until it was all gone. For similar case studies, see Fiorentina, Parma and Lazio of the same era, but at least those three teams could give their supporters something to shout about. And finally we arrive at April the 11th, 1998. They're a man down, they're 3 goals down, and the exciting underdog of the Serie A. Now, Parma, and they're teaching Napoli a lesson. The loss would officially relegate Napoli to Serie B for the first time in over 30 years. They'd spend just one season of the subsequent decade inside the top tier, one fewer than they did in the third tier. Napoli had gone from going toe-to-toe with giants and winning Scudetto and a UEFA Cup, to losing a playoff final to Avellino in the third tier of Italian football inside of a generation. They returned to Serie A in 2008 thanks to the crushingly sensible chairmanship of Aurelio De Laurentiis. He was the one stringent and patient enough to brutally knock down the house that Maradona built and, on those foundations, go again. They'd lift their third Scudetto in 2023, 2.5 years too late for Diego Maradona to have seen it. Maradona's Napoli had to face some incredible teams, one of which I mentioned already, Inter's 3 Germans, so click on this video to learn more about them.